Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, everyone. We are ready to start this seminar that has been organized in cooperation by the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in cooperation with the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. I'm very proud to be able to open this event on such an important topic. Just a couple of weeks before the parliamentary elections in this country, where this topic will play a role, but also 2 months before the European elections, where the topic will play a huge role as well. So we are dealing with an important issue, refugees and migrants, and we are focusing on the phenomenon as such at the global level, but also on European politics, policies and practices in this context. Migration has become a hugely divisive topic within the European Union, divisive not only between the member states, but also within the civil societies in member states. Many of these discussions and divisions are, however, based on perceptions rather than facts and evidence. So the goal of this seminar, where we have a number of eminent experts dealing with this topic, is to provide the facts and evidence so that we would not need to deal with perceptions only. Ladies and gentlemen, of course we are dealing with a global phenomenon which has different forms and different causes. So it's a multifaceted phenomenon, migration, that we are dealing with. The root causes for migration, as well as the role of migrants in transit countries, as well as target countries, the legal framework of migration, they are all important issues that we want to deal with when we analyze the phenomenon and its implications. I would like to thank here first my former colleague, Olli Ruohomäki, currently the senior advisor at the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Olli visited our institute 2 years and was hugely instrumental in many respects, produced a lot of research, but also gave us good ideas for seminars, and this is one of those products of fruitful cooperation. So many thanks, Olli, for your efforts. There was a lot of work, of course, behind this seminar, and you deserve great thanks for all that work. I would also, before I give the floor to Olli Ruohomäki, I would like to thank already our speakers. Thanks for coming to Finland. This is an excellent timing for this topic, and we really look forward your views and expertise on the topic of migration. Ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome, and without further ado, I will now give the floor to our moderator, Olli Ruohomäki. He will chair the seminar, and then after the presentations, we will give the opportunity also to you to make comments and ask questions. Olli, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Teija, for those very kind words. Good morning to everybody. Also on my behalf, a warm welcome. I think we're going to have a fantastic seminar this morning. I would like to set the tone for this morning's seminar by reading a passage from a recent work of non-fiction. I begin the quote, "I still think that being forced to leave your home out of fear is one of the worst injustices a human being can face. Everything you love is stolen, and you risk your life to live in a place that means nothing to you, and where because you come from a country now known for war and terrorism, you are not really wanted. So you spend the rest of your years longing for what you left behind while praying not to be deported." End of quote. The person writing this text is Nadia Murad, who won the Nobel Peace Prize recently. And the text from the book that I just quoted is titled "The Last Girl, My Story of Captivity and My Fight Against the Islamic State." There are an additional 68.5 million refugees and forcibly displaced persons in the world today. These figures come from UN statistics. Of course, fortunately, not all people are on the move because of extreme violence. There are over 258 million migrants around the world living outside their countries of birth. The figure is expected to grow for a number of reasons, including population growth, increased connectivity, trade, rising inequality, demographic imbalances, and climate change. Migration provides immense opportunities and benefits for the migrants, host communities, and communities of origin. However, there are significant challenges involved that include overwhelming social infrastructures with the unexpected arrival of large numbers of people and deaths of migrants undertaking dangerous journeys. We also can observe that at times the difference between refugees and migrants is blurred, depending on the circumstances. Unfortunately, criminal offenses perpetrated by some asylum seekers fuel the intensely heated debate regarding refugee and migration policies in host countries. We have witnessed this debate also in Finland in the past few months. The public discourse inevitably wraps and confuses the different movements, impacts, and consequences. An example of the wrapping and confusing the discourse is the way a number of populist parties in Europe, and the US for that matter, have used migrant and refugee debate to further their agendas and gain political power. Yashka Monk from Harvard University, in his latest book, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It, puts it aptly, and I quote, "When populists are running for office, they primarily direct their ire against ethnic or religious groups whom they do not recognize as part of the real people. Once populists hold office, they increasingly direct their ire against a second target, institutions, formal or informal, that dare to contest their claim to a moral monopoly of representation." End of quote. These are dangerous undercurrents that have no place in advanced democracies. In my view, some of the chauvinistic babble emanating from these populists is reminiscent of the poisonous atmosphere of 1930s Europe. Having served in a number of combat zones in war-torn countries and experienced the consequences of intense violence firsthand myself, I am deeply saddened by the current political climate in Europe pertaining to refugees and migrants. In civilized societies, the debates and policies should be informed by evidence and facts rather than prejudice and anecdote. It is with this in mind that today's seminar will discuss the present state of play of European migration and refugee debate, its broader global context, and possible ways for Finland to contribute to informed policymaking, with a particular emphasis on our development policies and practices. It is with great pleasure that I have the honor to introduce the first speaker, Professor Roger Zetter from Oxford University. In an academic career spanning almost 40 years of his research, publications, teaching, and consultancy experience in forced migration, refugee and humanitarian affairs includes all stages of the refugee cycle, focusing on institutional and policy dimensions of the refugee and humanitarian regime and the impacts on forcibly displaced people. He has written over 35 peer-reviewed papers, 6 books, over 20 book chapters, 15 major research reports, and numerous op-eds. I want to point out that his 1991 Journal of Refugee Studies paper, labeling refugees forming and transforming a bureaucratic identity, is one of the most widely cited in refugee studies. For the centenary of Oxford University Press journals, the paper was selected as one of the 100 most influential papers published over the previous century. He has done a lot of work for the different UN agencies, the World Bank, the governments of Denmark, Finland, Norway, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. So I am expecting Professor Zetter to paint a big picture revolving around the refugee and migrant debate. Roger, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Olli, for your extremely generous introduction. Listening to you, I wondered if you were introducing somebody else, actually, rather than me, but thank you nonetheless for your very generous words. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here today to speak to you, and as Olli said, to set a general picture, really, and then my colleagues on the panel will be elaborating some more detailed aspects. If we think about the global challenges of the 21st century, I guess probably high on our agenda, and I imagine a pretty firm consensus would be around the impacts of climate change across a whole range of social, economic, and political concerns. But after that, I guess we would start debating what else might be one of the global challenges of the 21st century. My argument today is that I think population mobility, and hence the rather ambitious title of the presentation I'm making, I would say is also a very significant global challenge, not just because, as earlier said, I've spent 4 decades of my academic life researching migration and displacement, and not just because I've just had the honour and privilege of completing a very demanding study for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs particularly on the subject of humanitarian and development policies. But because I think migration, as both the introductory speakers have said, dominates our political agenda for the first 20 years of this century, and it's a subject on which everybody has a view. Often, as earlier said, not a particularly attractive view, but everybody has a view on population mobility. And we can see this represented, I think, in many ways, the 2015 so-called refugee crisis of Europe. I'm not sure it was a refugee crisis, it was more a crisis of European governance, it seems to me, when after 13 years of creating a common European asylum system from the Lisbon meeting, that consensus, that 13-year effort to prepare the common European asylum system fell apart in about 6 months, and we are still seeing the consequences of that at a domestic level in many countries, including my own country, including Finland as well, and we are seeing the way in which Europe itself is still trying to formulate some kind of effective long-term response. Frontex budget is getting on for 300 million euros a year, which obviously has a very strong its objective is a migration management, some would argue migration control. We have a president of the United States of America who wants to build a beautiful wall. So we can see in many ways that migration, population mobility, whether we're dealing with the extreme of refugees or voluntary migrants, have become a very dominant part of our agenda. And it's no accident, it seems to me, that in very rapid time, 2 major global compacts have been prepared, one on migration, one on refugees, in 2018. It took only 2 years to prepare those compacts, which is remarkably quick time for the international community. Okay, they're not binding conventions, I accept that. But nonetheless, it is symptomatic, it seems to me, of the kind of challenges we face and why I believe that global mobility, populations on the move, both the challenges and the opportunities that that presents, is going to dominate our political agenda nationally and internationally, in supranational context, the European context, and globally, I think, for many years to come. I've set a very broad agenda today. I hope it's not too broad, but I really want to cover 4 aspects. As Olli says, I think part of the challenge is that there is a lot of misrepresentation. There is a lot of prejudice. There are a lot of anecdotes and assumptions, but I think it's quite important that we actually start with some of the figures to actually look at the numbers. And the numbers, in some ways, sort of rather challenge the kind of dramatic sense in which migration appears in the public rhetoric. I then want to turn my attention to another dimension, and each of these 4 components, they are linked, although there are separate aspects I want to deal with each one. I then want to look at the African continent. I want to look at sort of migration, and particularly the way Africa itself, both through the Africa Union and at a regional level, I think is a very proactive continent. We have a very Eurocentric view, I think, of Africa as a reservoir of unregulated migration. We, in Europe, see the potential of Africa and migration out of Africa as a problem. I think this actually underestimates just how, with very, very limited resources, by and large, well over 50 developing countries, some a bit more prosperous than others, they have a very proactive attitude and response and a responsibility for international migration. And I, again, want to sort of paint perhaps a different picture than might be the conventional populist image. I then want to step back a little bit and look at some of the major rethinking and the recalibration, the reformulation of the international response to international migration, and particularly my own area, forced displacement and refugees, because we have witnessed over the last 10 years or so a very major challenge in the way in which we see the complexity, particularly of forced displacement, of refugees and others who are extremely vulnerable, perhaps through human rights violations, perhaps through so-called failed development and so on, and how that vulnerability is translated into not just the global compacts, but also a rethinking of how we deal with the very large, relatively large number of people who are forcibly displaced. And then I want to sort of bring it back to Finland itself and propose 4 or 5 areas where I think Finland has particular expertise, particular challenges, particular opportunities that it can play its part in this international responsibility. Okay, so first of all then, looking at global mobility in numbers. Olli has already flagged up some of these figures. But despite the public rhetoric, in fact, international migration is not perhaps as large as we think. It's about 3%, we're dealing with stocks here, about 3%, about 255 million people, according to, albeit somewhat loose definitions by the IOM, could be deemed international migrants. About 9% are people who are moving within their own countries, and these by and large are what we might call voluntary migrants. I think what is interesting about this is that that figure, although the absolute number has risen, that 3% figure has been remarkably consistent for about the last 40 years. So the assumption that somehow international migration is increasing proportionately is in fact misplaced. Obviously it is increasing in numbers as the world demography changes, but that figure has remained remarkably fixed, even with the rapid changes in development, the globalization of world economies, the relatively freer movement of people globally. Perhaps what is more interesting, or equally interesting, is the fact that that 3% remains remarkably static. Of course, we don't know, as Olli says, whether that's going to change, but if we're predicting in the future from what's happened in the past, it may not change as much as we think. But I think what is actually another key point about global mobility is that south-south mobility is actually much greater and is increasing proportionately from south-north mobility. So again, this assumption that somehow there is an inevitability of movement from relatively poor countries to relatively rich countries, from the global south to the global north. This assumption, again, can be challenged. And in fact, what we see is that south-south mobility is increasing in numbers and proportion over the years as opposed to south-north mobility. So we can see on this slide here, something in the order of just over 90 million, this is 2015, about 37% of overall international mobility, this 255 million people I was talking about, are south to north, and a declining percentage, about 80 point something million, moving from south to north. If we actually then factor in north to south migration, again, about 13 million people, we actually find that the net south to north migration is in fact something in the order of just under 80 million people. So the significance, it seems to me, is first of all that the overall proportion is not changing, although the absolute numbers are. But south-south migration and the positive and negative impacts that creates for many of the countries in the global south is equally as challenging as we feel perhaps in our Eurocentric view in the north. Very large migration to countries like South Africa, to countries like Malaysia, which has a huge reservoir of labour, attractive destinations, hiring huge numbers of workers, countries like Brazil in Latin America. So again, we tend to think of migration being, or international migration being a European challenge. It is equally a challenge for poorer countries in the global south who have far less resources and whose economies are far less flexible and adaptable and have far less need for, by and large, relatively low-skilled labour. If we now look at the other end of the spectrum, the refugee spectrum, these are UNHCR figures, which Olli has already quoted, the 8.5 million. And what is interesting here is that the UNHCR in the last few years has actually been using the term forced displacement, forcibly displaced people, as you can see here. In other words, moving beyond the concept, the category, the 1951 Geneva Convention definition of the refugee, including in this figure the much larger number of people who are forcibly displaced within their own countries. Something in the order of 40 million people are IDPs in countries in the past like Colombia, countries like DRC, well over 2 to 3 million IDPs, South Sudan, and so on. Now, the nature of these figures, I think, is significant because unlike the proportion of voluntary migrants, what we can see is that the number and the proportion of refugees is increasing globally. The figures that I quoted, 68.5, is the kind of UNHCR, which is the benchmark statistics for forced displacement. That figure was 2017. The UNHCR publishes a global review every June, and obviously we're now waiting for the 2019 report, which will report on 2018 figures. But clearly the figure is going to be well over 70 million, because the figure, the 68.5, doesn't include the 800,000 Rohingya who moved forcibly displaced last year, and obviously other flows of refugees out of Syria and so on and so forth. This figure includes the IDPs, includes refugees, but what is significant, I think, is the trend line here. And what we can see here is that whereas the 3% is equivalent of 30 per 1,000 population globally of voluntary migrants, what we can see from the refugee perspective is that that figure is rising from about 7 per 1,000 to nearly 10 per 1,000 now. So we can see that the proportion is increasing as well as the absolute volume. What is significant also, and I'll come back to this, is that the nature of that displacement, and particularly the protracted nature of that displacement, is a very important phenomenon. Refugees do not go home any longer. Whereas in the 1990s, the decade of return was very significant, and difficult to believe that 1 million refugees per year, every year in the 1990s, went home. The phenomenon now is that refugees are in protracted displacement, something in the order, the mean is about 10 years of displacement, and obviously for some populations, much, much longer. Again, I think what is interesting is to look at the regional distribution of populations, and what this figure shows is that in fact in Europe we have about 14% of the global refugee population. Now here I'm talking specifically about the refugee population, not the 68.5 million, which includes Palestinian refugees and internally displaced people. This is 14% of about 20 million, which is the 2017 database. And as we know, and I think is important to reinforce, is that we have a relatively small proportion of refugees in Europe. If we look at the host countries, then we can see this figure, I think, elaborated. And we can see here the top 10 hosting countries. There are certainly some European countries there, as we can see, Germany. And what I've done is to put Finland there, not because it is one of the top countries. In fact, I just didn't have time to look at the databases of the UNHCR to look at all 180 countries and work out where Finland was on the league list, so to speak. But I should think it's probably around about 150, 170 of the total. But this gives some idea, I think, of the distribution, and it reinforces the point I made, really, that whether we're looking at international migration from a voluntary perspective or whether we're looking at refugee displacement, the forced displacement end of the spectrum, by and large it is a phenomenon concentrated in the global south or in transitional economies. Perhaps more significant is if we now look at the distribution, not absolutely, but in terms of the proportion per population, 1,000 population. And here we see a country like Lebanon, where, in fact, 1 in 5 people is a refugee. A country like Jordan, where the figures are about 700,000 refugees, that's the UNHCR figure, in a population of about 10 million. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan argues that that figure is an underestimate, and all these figures are underestimates, because, surprising as it may seem, many people who could claim refugee status do not do so. Jordan claims that the figure is probably near about 1.4 million. And again, I put sort of Finland at the bottom with about 4 per 1,000 population compared with the major hosting countries. And again, we can see that these are either middle-income countries which have relatively fragile economies, or they are countries that have, by and large, limited capacity and limited resources. I've picked out some of those countries just again to look in a bit more detail at some of the data here, and to compare also the GDP of countries. And we can see the percentages here. As I've said, Lebanon, it's about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 is of the population of refugees. Turkey, although Turkey is the biggest host country globally in the world, because Turkey has a very large population, the percentage is quite low. But what I've done is now to compare that with Finland. If Finland was Lebanon, if Finland was Jordan, this is the kind of proportion we'd be talking about. If we take the UNHCR figure, Finland would have about 400,000 refugees instead of about 23,000, I think. If you went by the government of Jordan figures, about 1.5 million refugees, you'd have 775,000 refugees. Sorry, that's Jordan. And if you were Lebanon, the figures would be enormous. So, again, I'm manipulating the data, you could say, but this is the data that we deal with. And I think it's important because it does show the way in which we have a perception and a set of anecdotes about the nature of global mobility, particularly about the nature of refugee displacement, which is really quite disproportionate to the reality that is actually faced by many of the host countries in the global south. I want to now look to the second part of my presentation and what I've called Out of Africa, a slightly sort of punning title because we have this assumption that Africa, as I say, is a reservoir of irregular, involuntary migrants and refugees transiting across the Mediterranean, which indeed did happen, although not mainly from Africa in 2015. The figures now are down to about 115,000 last year transiting across the Mediterranean, which the Vice President of the European Commission has now said the refugee crisis is over, or the migration crisis is over. I'm not sure there ever was a crisis as such. 1 million people arriving in a continent of over 500 million proportionately is not a huge challenge, although clearly the particular countries where the Syrian refugees ended up was a relatively short-term problem in my view. But let's look at Africa. I would argue that the African Union is one of the leading intergovernmental bodies trying to deal with migration, trying to deal with international migration at a continental level and at a regional level. And it has been at the forefront, I think, for 50 years. And I think what we have to remember is that it's been at the forefront with incredibly limited resources, limited governance capacity to manage migration in the way that we can with Frontex and through European Commission activities, and limited resources in terms of just the sheer capacity of economies to absorb people on the move. It created its own refugee convention 50 years ago, which is a much wider definition of refugees than, in fact, the 1951 Geneva, the global 1951 Geneva Convention. It has a more generous attitude and a more generous designation, if you like, of the refugee. It is the first intergovernmental body and the only one so far to have actually created a convention on internal displacement. Internal displacement clearly is politically an even more sensitive area for international lawmaking, international conventions, because it's dealing obviously with the internal affairs and the sovereignty of countries. And the argument is that governments themselves have the obligation and are the duty bearers for the rights of those people who are internally displaced. What the Kampala Convention has done in 2009, it has now been ratified by a sufficient number of states in the African Union to become a convention, is to create conditions and establish rights for those who are internally displaced, the far greater number than there is of refugees. This year, the Africa Union Summit is celebrating what it calls the Year of Refugees, IDPs and Returnees. So this is a 50-year history of trying to tackle, in its own terms and its own capacities, obviously with international assistance, the refugee problem. There is an Africa Union, EU, UN task force facilitated by UNHCR and IOM on Libya. So again, at sort of particular aspects, the Africa Union is active in trying to adopt the policy of responsibility sharing, which is the big buzzword in the 2018 Refugee Compact. And at a regional level as well, we can see the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, it established, it's difficult to believe, almost 35 years ago, a free movement protocol in the same way that we have the free movement of labour within the European Union. In fact, it predated our own, I think, was it the Maastricht Treaty that created mobility, free movement of labour. ECOWAS was ahead of the curve, as it has been ahead of the curve in the definition of refugees and in its response to internal displacement. We find in the Horn of Africa another intergovernmental regional authority, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. It started life on environment and climate change mobility in the Horn of Africa, 9 countries, about 130 million people. It's a turbulent region. It has about 65% of Africa's IDPs and over 70% of Africa's refugees. But what we see is that IGAD is, again, with some international assistance from the World Bank, amongst others, is transferring and translating itself and its capacity from a concern with environmental mobility and climate change, its impact on people's livelihoods and their mobility, into an early warning platform on conflict and the potential displacement effects of conflict. So it is working to develop common minimum standards of protection for internally displaced people under the auspices of the Kampala Convention. It's developing an early warning system for cross-border movements, and it's trying to develop and link national immigration systems so that there is some kind of harmonization of them in the way that the ECOWAS community has done. And then in Southern Africa, slightly less progress, slightly more problematic, but the SADC region is developing common responses to climate change, which, as we know, is going to be a major driver of population mobility through the rest of this century. And then just to pinpoint 2 countries, Rwanda and Uganda, whatever we may think about the political regime of Rwanda, it is a relatively small country, about 12 million population, relatively small number of refugees, 170,000 refugees, but it is, surprisingly enough, a world leader in the way it is responding to the refugees in the country in terms of providing all the rights that are established in the 51 Geneva Convention, the right to work, the right to own land, the right to own property. Many of those rights, in fact, are derogated by many of the countries that I've been talking about for obvious reasons to protect their own populations. It has acceded to all these articles. Uganda, again, a country of about 40 million people, about 5% of the population refugees, about 2 million. And again, Uganda has developed a remarkably effective but indigenous response to the impact of refugees on its country. Again, providing land for refugees so that they can develop their own livelihoods. There are a lot of problems that research that I and many others have done about the livelihood strategies that are developed or the foundations for livelihood strategies for refugees in Uganda. But nonetheless, one cannot gainsay the very proactive response that the Ugandan government has taken over the last 20 years. So in many ways, despite the lack of resources, despite the fragile governance of these countries, there is remarkable sort of proactive response. There are lessons learned about not just the issues of economies and livelihoods and how these people are going to get jobs, but also in terms of the kind of social processes of how different communities, those who are forcibly displaced, that very powerful vignette that Olli provided at the beginning of what it is to be displaced in a country, how we can develop forms of social cohesion and so on. These are countries that are, in fact, I think, leading the way. The third part of my presentation is to sort of step back, if you like, from some of the facts, some of what is actually happening globally, but to look at the 2 major changes that have taken place, I would say, over the last 10 years or so in the international architecture of our response to forced displacement and our response to refugees. The first of these is a concept which is now almost de rigueur and is actually now used by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. They now use the term forced displacement, although their mandate responsibility, of course, is for refugees and people in refugee-like situations, as it's described. But what we can see is that over the last decade, maybe longer, displacement has become much more complex, and what is described by academics and in practice as multi-causal. Obviously, people do flee conflict. They flee at the barrel of a gun. But what we are also seeing is that very often violence and conflict is really the end stage of many other factors of human rights violations, the impact perhaps of environmental degradation and conflict over increasingly scarce resources, the impact of other kinds of existential threats to perhaps ethnic and religious minorities. And increasingly, therefore, it is very hard to define a refugee as somebody who is fleeing persecution from well-founded fears, 5 well-founded fears that are established in the 51 Convention. And I think this multi-causal, the way in which these drivers of displacement overlap with each other, challenges many of the premises of the EU agenda, that somehow there are large numbers of irregular migrants, large numbers of falsely claiming refugees arriving on our shores. The nature of forced displacement is now extremely complex. And I'm not just making that point because it is an interesting question, a researchable question as an academic, but it is a vital question for policymakers. Because what we see is that we have 2 global compacts, one for refugees, one for migrants. Many of the people we're talking about actually fall between the 2. And this is the problem. My argument, which is obviously an argument because I don't have to face the realpolitik, is that in fact the 2 compacts are very, very problematic. And in fact, what they've done is very effectively seal this difference between a particular category, the refugee, a particular category, the voluntary migrant, and the management of migration. And in fact, what we see in the nature of forced displacement is in fact a much more complex picture of people who have enormous rights and needs. Their vulnerability is extreme, but the protection machinery for them is now sealed by these 2 compacts. What we also see is the patterns and processes of displacement are very different. Refugees don't just move from a country of origin to a neighbouring country and stay there until there is a durable solution. They can return, they might be resettled in a third country, or they might be integrated locally. What we see is people moving backwards and forwards, a very interesting phenomenon, for example, of Iraqi refugees at the beginning of this century from Syria, is that they were constantly moving backwards and forwards. They had refugee status, but they were going back to Iraq even in situations of war, to assess the potential conditions for return, to assess how members of the family who'd stayed behind were surviving, and so on. We find that internal displacement, as I've said, is a much larger phenomenon than cross-border movements. We find that most refugees don't live in camps now, the archetype symbol of the refugee. They live in urban areas, side by side, usually with poor, vulnerable populations. And obviously we have these enormous out-of-region irregular migration and mixed movements. The key point here is that it's not this simple A to B. The assumption that you're a refugee, you stay there till we the international community, find a solution to your displacement. And what we also find is that it is protracted. I mentioned earlier the nature of protracted displacement. And this again, like the phenomenon of forced displacement, the patterns and processes, again, pose enormous challenges to the international community, to humanitarian actors. Who is the refugee? What kind of needs do they have? What does this kind of what kinds of protection might this irregular migrant who cannot claim refugee status, what does she need? women and girls are particularly vulnerable in this kind of interim category that don't fit one or other of the neat sort of compact labels and designations. Then the other major change is more, not so much a concept, but much more a kind of operational phenomenon, what's called the humanitarian development nexus. What we realize is that if we're dealing with increasingly complex and increasingly protracted displacement and refugees not living in camps, we have to think of longer-term responses. We cannot have a constant humanitarian assistance program over 10 years. It's unaffordable, for one thing. It's unsustainable. And it deprives those who are displaced of the dignity and independence that would come from a more developmental response to their situation. And so the humanitarian development nexus has been developed and is being promoted by a whole raft of intergovernmental bodies from the World Bank, the UN family. At a country level, it was an important theme of our evaluation for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which we've just completed. In other words, it's dealing with this interface between development and the immediate humanitarian emergency needs and longer-term development requirements. It's very important, as we realize, obvious in retrospect, but it's taken some long time for this phenomenon to be appreciated, that the host communities are hugely impacted by the arrival of refugees. If you've got 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 of your population, the impact on labour markets, the impact on housing markets, the impact on the food markets is enormous. So we now see in the Global Compact on refugees a reinforcement of humanitarian and developmental assistance, which has to be bipartisan. It has to be for the refugees and the host populations as well. The macro and the microeconomic impacts, a lot of the work I've done recently for the World Bank is trying to measure the macroeconomic impacts of refugees on these relatively poor countries. They are phenomenal. The impact of Syrian refugees on the Lebanese economy, for example, had a negative impact of about 3% of GDP for the first 3 years. So we have to look at the totality. And it does mean responsibility sharing. What is the responsibility of the wealthy global north? And we can see the way that this nexus has been institutionalized through New York Declaration, World Humanitarian Summit, and these global compacts. What do we mean by the humanitarian development nexus? There's a definition that we provided in our evaluation, and I've summarized it here, and it really has 3 components. It's looking at a complementarity between the immediate humanitarian needs and the longer-term developmental programming that a country like Finland, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which has both hats, if you like, it's both a humanitarian actor and a development actor, working in some of the most fragile countries in the world, some of the most vulnerable populations. We need to look at a complementarity. We need to look at the transition between short and long-term emergency assistance, between something that saves lives, but is also building the resilience of those communities that are displaced. And it is linking the hosts and the forcibly displaced people. What are the implications of this for Finland? Not an easy segue from what I've just been talking about, the third component, but bringing together some of the presentation that I've made today. What are the implications? I think the most important, in my view, and I suppose the most political, one might say, is a challenge for Finland, but it is a challenge for every European country that has confronted what it perceives to be the 2015 European refugee crisis, is to decouple development from migration policies. What we've seen in Finland, and it's, as I say, the same in many other countries where there is a large-scale development and humanitarian presence by the government in the global south, but a country that also has a concern to protect its borders and to limit migration. What we've seen is the way in which development policies have increasingly come to serve domestic migration control and management policies. Development has its own integrity. Development has its own purposes. It shouldn't be mixed up and muddled up with as an instrument of migration control. There's a huge amount of research which actually shows that, in fact, development policies are not a very effective tool anyway to manage global migration. But even setting that aside, as I say, development has its own integrity. Migration policies have their own political integrity wherever you stand on the political spectrum about hard borders or soft borders. But my point is that we need, if you want to manage migration, there are other ways that you can do that. Development is not one of them. And to use development policies to manage migration undermines, I think, the effectiveness and the power of development policies for the poor countries that we are talking about. On forced displacement, I think here the forced displacement lens is very important for Finland, particularly in the kind of countries it works in the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Afghanistan, parts of Syria where there have been limited humanitarian programs. These are very, very complex processes, and I just created a kind of snapshot earlier. And it seems to me that it raises quite important questions about how Finland addresses urban displaced populations, the refugees in urban areas, how it addresses internally and how it provides developmental assistance for internally displaced people. 3-4 million Afghans are displaced internally. What we found in the study is that policies do not align with the large number of internally displaced people in those countries. And climate change as well. Another, one can argue to what extent climate change forces displacement. But again, we've found that it's gone a little bit on the back burner, surprisingly, in Finnish policies, in the last development policies in the last 2 to 3 years. So in this context, Finland as an international development cooperation actor is demarcated by long-term engagement in these countries. But it needs to find ways of perhaps addressing these very complex, mixed, irregular flows, a more nuanced understanding of the processes, the rights, the needs of these populations and their vulnerabilities in this broad category of forced displacement, I think is important. On protracted displacement, it seems to me, again, that Finland has a long history and is very well disposed to long-term engagement in countries. It doesn't spend 4 or 5 years in a country and then pull out. It works long-term, and this is part of the tradition and the strength, if you like, of Finnish development and humanitarian policies. And it seems to me that it is, again, well-placed to tackle protracted displacement, but the policies need to align a little bit more on the long-term developmental needs of displaced populations in these countries, making the connection between what it does already in its development and its humanitarian policies, but looking at the longer-term developmental strategies that might be appropriate. And that, I think, segues to my fourth point, that the humanitarian development nexus is a very valuable analytical tool for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to reshape its development policy, but beyond analysis, it seems to me that it's an important, it leads to important sort of policy objectives and policy purposes, particularly perhaps in reframing the 2020 DPP in the way in which it can promote development for refugees and forcibly displaced people over the long term in the countries in which it is involved. And Finland has indeed been very involved in developing the global compact itself, the Refugee Compact, its membership of UNHCR, donor groups and so on. It's in a very powerful position to influence and shape the humanitarian development nexus as an international policy apparatus, but also in terms of its own policies. And then finally, to bring the presentation to a close, in addition to the humanitarian development nexus, gaining increasing interest, not just by scholars, but by the humanitarian development actors themselves, is what's called the triple nexus. The International Committee, the Red Cross, amongst others, has been very engaged in developing thinking about this, It's the humanitarian peace development nexus. Even if we synchronize and overlap and look at the synchronization of humanitarian and development interests, what we realize is that many of the countries that we are talking about are countries that are in a very fragile condition. Peace is not a given, it's not guaranteed. Finland, again, has a very long tradition in civilian crisis management at a kind of macro level, in peace building, in establishing rights, particularly rights for women and girls, at a very operational level in terms of mine clearance and so on. Finland has wide expertise in the peace part of the nexus, the P. I've described it as a niche there, which I think is a bit unfair. It's more than a niche. It's a huge global priority, one might say. You can't have development without peace, and you cannot have effective humanitarian responses unless you're promoting peace as well. And it seems to me that, again, there is a lot of potential here for Finland, both in terms of its own policy disposition as a development and humanitarian and peace-building actor, but also to influence international thinking on the take-up of the humanitarian peace development nexus. Thank you.
Olli, for this also very kind introduction. It's quite a tall order for me to speak after Professor Roger Zetter, but I'll try my best to give an overview of what's been happening at the EU policy sphere. I'll do that by focusing mainly on Africa, EU external migration cooperation with African countries. But how does that? Right. But I want to start with looking at some of the quick trends and influences. Some of them have been mentioned already in the previous presentation, but I'll want to explain how they've influenced EU policies and policy narratives on migration. And then I move to EU-Africa cooperation specifically at different levels. And I'll end with some dilemmas for a balanced approach towards African countries when it comes to migration and an outlook. So Roger has mentioned it. Europe has been in a so-called crisis moment. This is basically what has defined the experience of European countries. This graph depicts irregular border crossings on the three main Mediterranean routes from 2014 to 2018. You can see in 2015 the big spike, which has sort of led to the governance crisis that European countries have found themselves in. Obviously, that's not all the irregular crossings. You can add other routes, such as the Western Balkan route to it. And then, again, in the broader context, irregular migration is not the largest migration that takes place to the EU. There's the legal migration dimension, which has been more prominent, actually, in numbers. Then again, this picture also we've probably seen in quite different variations, sort of all arrows pointing towards the European Union from African countries coming, and it very much sort of, that's from The Economist in 2015, it very much depicts the image and sort of the threat that is depicted by these irregular flows and the spike that has happened. Now, Roger mentioned it. We have now, just this week, have the announcement from the European Commission that it is a myth that Europe is experiencing a migration crisis. Europe is no longer in crisis mode. That is a screenshot from the recent communication. Then again, I think we can debate what type of crisis it actually was, but I think what the EU Commission means here is that the numbers have gone down to Europe so that there's no longer sort of a need to propel. If I go back to this, it's very interesting that in policy terms, even though the spike actually went down quite a bit in 2016 beginning already, in policy terms the crisis was kept alive until actually now. So we'll see whether this is now sort of really the end of the policy debate on it. I doubt it, because in the same sort of communication you find quite mixed messages saying that even though Europe is no longer in crisis mode, one sentence is that a steady rise in migratory pressure and the rise of instability beyond EU borders will keep migration at the head of the challenges facing the EU. So I don't think we'll expect sort of a calming down necessarily, but this may also be communications ahead of the European elections. From the African perspective, that depicts, it's simplifying, but that picture may depict the migration realities experienced more from within Africa and some of the numbers that Roger has been talking about. Within Africa, migration seen largely within the continent, largely regional also. Flows within West Africa managed also by the ECOWAS Free Movement Protocol, Roger mentioned. In the Horn of Africa, maybe more largely characterized by displacement and instability that drives migration, and then also large flows towards South Africa. That picture, or that understanding is obviously different from sort of the EU crisis mode, which led in a recent interview one African Union official to comment that if there's a crisis at all, it's within the African continent and not in the EU. One interesting fact, actually, if we talk so much about irregular migration, again, the majority of migration into the EU still takes place regularly. An interesting development with regards to Africa is that since 2008, if we take the visa and residence permits given to African nationals sort of before their arrival, so one measure of legal migration, is that they actually significantly declined since 2008, where it was at about 440,000 per year to the EU in 2008. In 2012, that dropped to 270,000 and remained steady until 2016, around that figure. That is an interesting notion because now in a lot of the policies also of the European Commission, there's this notion that we need to provide more legal opportunities for migrants also to reduce irregular flows. But in this measure, actually the opposite has been happening. Now, what narratives has that led to, and how has that influenced EU policy towards Africa? So I've studied a lot of the policy documents over the last years. You see different narratives competing, and they've been influencing also EU development in international cooperation policies quite strongly. The first one is sort of the narrative of migration as a threat to national security, which obviously has been coming quite stronger in the past years. The policy implication of that is obviously to reduce irregular migration, control borders better, both sort of through Frontex and the EU Border and Coast Guard, but also a move to upstream management of migration flows, for example, within Africa. Second narrative, and all these narratives you find in all policy documents, so they're competing, but the balance has shifted, as I'll explain later. And that's why I've highlighted the first one, which is has become much more prominent. The second narrative is migration as a symptom of poverty, conflict, and weak governance. That also obviously has some truth to it. There's a lot of challenges related to migratory movements that are motivated by these aspects. And that led to this whole notion of we need to address root causes better. We need to use development cooperation to basically reduce any of those causes so that the negative type of movement and unwanted movement does not take place. Third narrative, maybe most strongly also found at the international level of the Sustainable Development Goals that has integrated migration, and the Global Compact is one that sees migration as an opportunity for livelihoods and long-term development. Certainly also quite some evidence for that migration is part of broader development transitions, and that it, for the migrants themselves, often does lead to resilience or livelihood generation. And here the policy implication is also for development cooperation that you would actually use it to maximize these development outcomes. So make migration safer, focus on cost of remittances, reducing the cost of recruitment costs, and maximizing this positive impact that migration can have. And then the fourth issue is also complementary, seeing migration as a humanitarian and protection issue. This is precisely what Roger has been saying about bringing humanitarian and development funding together, protecting and integrating and offering better opportunities for vulnerable migrants. For the EU, that has actually become stronger, also sort of out of a maybe self-interested motivation to reduce, or with the idea to reduce possible secondary migratory flows. So the realization that if we invest a lot in protection in the region, or if we support countries that host a large amount of migrants, they may actually find better livelihood opportunities there, and they less chance that they move onwards towards the European Union. Now, how have these influenced the policies of the EU? And I will explain a bit how, especially the first narrative on the migration as a threat to national security and welfare has influenced the EU-Africa dimensions, both in terms of the policy language as well as also in monetary terms. But again, you will mostly find all these four narratives in all the cooperation that is taking place. Now, cooperation with Africa takes place at different levels. If we start with the continental level, or let's say with a group of African countries together, there actually has been quite a long-standing engagement on migration. It may have been a bit under the radar because migration was not such a huge political topic for the EU. But since 2007, you have, for example, the Joint Africa-EU strategy, which included migration and development as a topic. It included also sort of the addressing and managing of irregular migration, as well as the more positive aspects. And there's an interesting sentence, I just looked it up yesterday. The first sentence under this heading of the Joint Africa-EU strategy of that time was, migration and mobility are interwoven with the history of human development and should be treated as largely positive. Now, this sentence is something you would not find in any of the policy documents today. There's large divisions within the EU about the nature of migration, whether it's positive or whether it's negative, whether it's both. But this is a sentence that is definitely was possible at the time. The language has very much changed towards we need to address irregular migration, we need to reduce it, and we need to address root causes. That is sort of the main framing now. But the issue with this Joint Africa-EU strategy and the cooperation was that it was very much between the European Commission and the African Union Commission. There was actually little interest shown by member states, so that the policy dialogue and engagement stayed largely between two bodies that did not necessarily have all the competences on migration issues, which is largely national. So that did actually not lead to much, and was then also, as I will explain later, superseded by much more strong focus on the Valletta Declaration, regional cooperation, and bilateral one. Then you have the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries that have legal agreements with the European Union. Again, migration is part of it since decades. Here I would argue that it has led to a lot of sort of development cooperation projects through this partnership around issues such as remittances, but also trafficking. But it didn't really have a strong political traction. And there was quite some frustration also from the side of the EU that these dialogues with so many different countries, even spanning not only Africa but Caribbean, Pacific, does not to lead any sort of concrete measures. Then in 2015, when it became more acute that the EU wanted to do something, it invited a number of African countries to the Valletta Summit. That was an EU-initiated process, even though it was sort of communicated also as a sort of start of a partnership with African countries. There was quite some tension around that, because some of the regional economic communities that have policies that Roger has mentioned, as well as the African Union, were not initially invited. And the other point was that it wasn't a full continental, so the EU invited those African countries where it had strongest interest. But that was a deliberate push to become much more concrete and also move to the bilateral level, which I'll come into my next slide. Just to quickly mention, the UN-AU task force on return from Libya has actually, I think, calmed a bit the tension that then existed after Valletta with the African Union, because there is good cooperation around a very specific topic where also objectives between the EU and African Union collide on migration and return, and also protection of African migrants. Then you have the regional level, also largely sort of initiated by EU member states. Rabat process in 2006, initiated by Spain after sort of strong irregular migration increase from Morocco. That has built some trust and common understanding over longer-term migration and development challenges. The Rabat process actually is quite comprehensive in terms of including a number of topics related to migration, but it's increasingly coming under pressure also with the EU agenda closing more on the aim to reduce irregular migration, putting pressure on that process. But that process includes African and European countries, including Finland is following it, on the sort of Sahel space and migratory routes. The idea was here to go away from that continental level, where so many countries with very different migrant experiences and needs are mixed together, to actually focus on specific routes where there may be common joint objectives. Similarly, on the Khartoum process that was established in 2014, there's a number of EU member states coming together with countries in the Horn of Africa. That has been initiated by Italy under the presidency. And here again, I think what sort of from the African Union perspective, there was a feeling that they had for some time had come up with a Horn of Africa initiative looking at trafficking through their own African Union processes. They felt that now Italy takes it, puts a lot of money behind it, and kind of bypasses the structures that they would have liked to see. But this is sort of what came out of it. It is much more focused on trafficking and smuggling. It did, the narrow focus did raise concerns among researchers and experts about the human rights implications also of the cooperation that is discussed on border management under this process. But there is also some emphasis on human rights protection and training and root causes aspects. Then even further, there's specific initiatives also funded by or initiated by EU countries, for example, bringing Mali, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Morocco now together to even become more concrete to, for the EU's interest, manage migration more upstream. But the real push, I think, for the EU has happened at the bilateral level, because that's where it felt it can actually make most gains in its need to reduce irregular migration numbers to the EU. And that very much came out of the realization that the Common European Asylum System negotiations stalled, that there was an increasing divergence of positions between member states of how to internally actually manage migration, which led to the sort of reinstallment of border controls, led to pressure on Schengen, and to make the EU move outward to address the problem actually it had internally on solidarity, to reduce, if you basically reduce irregular flows, the problem would go away, and there's not much of the crisis now. And the EU now claims it has been successful in that. That's why there's no crisis anymore. But with African countries, that meant the EU adopted an EU migration partnership framework, which largely put its development cooperation, but also all other EU external action tools, including trade, including visa resettlement, under sort of the leverage to get other countries to cooperate on migration management. Now, the EU does present that as a comprehensive agenda, and there's a lot of components that may include things like humanitarian development nexus, protection. It is meant to include legal migration, but largely and behind the scenes, the aim is measured, success is measured by two things. One is, does it help to reduce irregular migration to the EU? And second, does it help the EU being able to send more migrants back and with return and readmission? So these are the sort of two success criteria, as you wish, for the partnership agreement. Initially, the focus been on 5 priority countries: Ethiopia, Mali, Nigeria, and Senegal. Also now, sort of maybe under this framework, other countries in North Africa are being approached, also Asia, Bangladesh, for example. Then you can debate whether the sort of what the measure of progress and success should be. The EU claims that its partnership with Niger has been very successful because precisely a law was passed that makes it illegal to travel northward towards Libya. A lot more cooperation around sort of security interventions and military stopping irregular migrants and smugglers. So for the EU, that has been a successful country, and then there's a lot of engagement with the development cooperation projects and job creation around that. Maybe less successful in Côte d'Ivoire and in North African countries. Here, Côte d'Ivoire is a country where the EU member states, or some of them, would like to return more migrants. But here, that engagement and also actually the use of incentives has not actually led to much more engagement on that. So it's as Roger has said, it's not always the most effective way. North African countries, yes, there's cooperation with Egypt, increasingly with Morocco on managing migration, but the EU concepts such as disembarkation platforms, for example, are also very difficult to accept for these countries due to internal political economy issues that is not acceptable for them. Now, the African Union has been very critical of this approach going bilaterally, and that is because it does fear that the EU's approach, one, undermines the African migration governance frameworks, because it's not transparent, because it's sort of bilateral deal, and it may also go against some of the provisions that are in the continental frameworks. So the question is, for example, how bilateral deals, such as the one in Niger, fit with the regional and continental policies of free movement, which actually tries to create the space. So there has been little kind of exchange and engagement, so that why the African Union was very critical of that approach. Equally critical on these disembarkation platforms that I mentioned, they've been largely rejected by North African countries so far, but also here the African Union strongly actually intervened, saying it contravenes international law, it violates the rights of Africans, and it would undermine African solidarity amongst countries. So here, it's one of the dilemmas also the EU faces, because the EU has been for a long time supporting African regional integration and including actually supporting governance frameworks such as the ECOWAS Free Movement Protocol. That's why I want to come to some of the dilemmas with the agenda that the EU has. So in development cooperation, we did see, and I did a study on that, how much migration is actually now part of EU member states and also the EU's strategy and largely focusing on irregular migration and root causes. But this sort of focus in the partnerships with a prime objective on reducing irregular migration essentially, or manage migration, it potentially skews the objectives. It can come at the cost of other critical challenges in these partner countries, such as the weak governance, broader human security and human development aspects. And there's not always a clear discussion around how such actions actually interact with them. An example is also Niger and Mali, where these sort of intervention do create initial tensions because it cracks down on a complete industry and any sort of efforts of development also to build up jobs or recreate does not go in the same time scale. So if you have a politically unstable situation already and you have a lot of young people that suddenly do not have opportunities, there is a question what they do otherwise. So sometimes they reroute, they may take other routes and still migrate. Other times they may actually become more frustrated and upheave the sort of stability. So there are these questions of how much focus you actually put on migration management as a prime objective. Similarly, with the securitized responses to smuggling, there's been quite some research on how that actually can harden criminalized smuggling networks. So there is evidence that there are sort of different types of, let's say, smuggling networks that exist, ranging from the very criminal to actually just people that help in a loose network and earn their livelihoods. But the more you sort of crack down and push and have a security response, the more you actually drive out those that say that are less on the criminal side, and the more those that are very well organized, they can adapt and they can actually, and they are the ones possibly even gaining from it. Then the second dilemma is about the partnership notion between EU and Africa. I think it has been quite a challenge for the EU, given as a sort of a joint body, given that internally the divisions are so large, to actually have a very balanced partnership approach to African countries. And by that I mean not only starting from the sort of internal needs of the EU, but looking at these broader migration challenges that African countries face, as Roger has mentioned, and that actually have a very different starting point, possibly. The second challenge has been then embedding in a more comprehensive partnership beyond migration. So that has been the aim. The EU Commission also says that, and the European External Action Service, they would like to see much more engagement, not only on migration, but around broader issues, and then have migration as part of it. That has been a challenge because we've seen the instrumentalization of EU migration cooperation, development cooperation, and we have actually seen very little in terms of, for example, actually migration policies or legal pathways, as well as other more broader issues being part of that discussion. Also, a challenge is to have sufficient time for sort of trust building and time for consultations with partners. There's been several, I mean, Valletta has been one of these issues where the African side was a bit surprised that this comes in and there's not been much engagement. The European Investment Plan was another, or the Juncker Plan announcing things maybe largely meant for the European audience, but selling it as a partnership without actually African partners having been in the picture or consulted, and there's several of these examples. So I think the internal pressure of the EU politically also puts the pressure on the ability to act as a real partner. Another issue the EU now faces is, and that largely builds on the divergence within the EU that I've mentioned, is that it has this challenge of not being able to necessarily strongly put its engagement on the global compact, simply because a number of EU member states are not fully behind it. That can create a problem because, the EU has been actually instrumental in EU member states have in negotiating that compact, and they introduced also quite stronger language on return, on reintegration. And then at the last minute, politically, some member states pulled out. So there's also a credibility issue now, possibly with the EU itself, on the one hand, demanding other countries to better manage migration because they feel that it helps the EU, while at the same time actually becoming much more restrictive, both on asylum seekers, refugees' rights internally, as well as not possibly actually as a bloc being able to champion internationally the global agreements that have been made. The missing elephant, I already said it in the room, is that of legal labor migration. Obviously, it's a big challenge. It is always still in the policy documents, though. In every document you find is the need to, in that comprehensive approach the EU wants to have, to also include migration opportunities. Now, sometimes it's framed as, okay, that helps reduce irregular migration, it helps transform irregular to regular. Sometimes it's used as we need to have it to use it as leverage, similar to EU aid and development cooperation. There's pilot schemes that the EU Commission asked member states to come forward with African countries as part of Valletta. They've been very slow to start. You have only a couple of these schemes by now. At the same time, the EU policies have become increasingly selective on what type of legal migration it actually offers. While in the past that was more open and also included a different level of skills, now in the most sort of recent policy document it's very limited on refugees, so resettlement. So again, that categorization of who is actually would have the right to come based on the refugee convention, and then the high-skilled migrants. Everything in between is actually right now not included, at least in the EU policies. Some EU member states obviously have their own policies and are the ones deciding who comes in. There's still interesting developments at the level of EU member states. Some start also based on a notion to have to reconcile this need on the one hand politically to reduce irregular migration, but on the other hand preparing for the future of an aging society, where it is not true that necessarily only high-skilled are needed, but different skill levels. So one aspect that is also championed by the global compact on migration is this notion of global skills partnerships, where essentially you tag together education or skills in partner countries with migration opportunities that can be either circular or permanent. So there's a couple of pilots that have been starting, for example, with Morocco and Tunisia, between Belgium and Germany. These are very small scale, and then there are still a number of challenges in terms of whether origin countries in Africa actually have the necessary skill level and education systems in place for it to match the needs of European labor markets. At the same time, also whether actually then if you target, and it's very small scale, so it would not make a massive difference with irregular migration, but even if you target the same type of people. Outlook on the EU agenda. Currently the migration topic is still very large when it comes to the budget discussion, and that is important because obviously where the money is also where a lot of the impact may happen. There are discussions now currently in two parts of the budget. One is on the external action side. The EU has proposed a single instrument. It's large. It's increasing by a large amount the European external funds. But within that, the interesting idea is to have 10% allocated for migration, framed as addressing root causes. Now, that can be very broad. Some EU member states would like to see that even higher, 20, 30% upwards. That is part of the discussion. Nothing is yet sort of negotiated, as well as the overall levels are not fixed. But it shows that the prominence of migration and also how it influences development cooperation will remain, and will most likely end up with a lot amount of money to spend on that. And then the question is on what and with what starting points and how it's being programmed, and whether it takes the EU narrow, let's say, approach to migration management, or whether it starts with a more humanitarian development nexus. Then another negotiation is taking place with African countries on the successor of the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, that is with the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. Here again, I think migration is a quite strong element, but divisions within the EU and some member states actually not agreeing with some of the language that has been put in the negotiation mandate even led to very early blockages. So we'll see here how far the different narratives and the different angles of both continents actually can come together. So I'll end with a key question that we can maybe discuss further, is how we can find more balanced approaches when considering all these different realities and the different narratives that take place, and each policy angle also having sort of a genuine or legitimate objective, but if they come together, not always necessarily being coherent with each other, or fulfilling different objectives that can have impact on, let's say, stability, development, if we manage migration in this way. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Olli, thank you very much, and good morning to you all. I think it's still morning. Yes, it is. Well, it's a privilege to be here this morning to speak to you all. I do think that not just my biography, but I think the two previous speakers speak really to the complexity of this issue. And so you have my sympathy. I believe some of you are policymakers and some of you are academics. I guess if you're an academic, it's good news because complexity keeps you busy. If you're a policymaker, it probably keeps you up at night. And what I would like to do, particularly taking the kind of high-level view that the previous two speakers have given us, is to dive into one particular country and really try and speak a little bit to this complexity from the point of view of one country, Sierra Leone, in terms of the ways that, as Roger talked about, these the complex interplay now between the driving forces of movement and the fact that we have instruments that don't necessarily fit very well with the realities on the ground in terms of where people are and what they're doing. So I would hope to contribute, as I said, from that sort of point of view of a case study. And where I would want to start really is talking about Sierra Leone, and I think that Roger mentioned this, is the prevalence of fragility. And this Sierra Leone is just one of many countries that is described as a fragile and conflict affected. And the thing about fragility is that in the Commission on State Fragility, Escaping the Fragility Trap, identifies 5 interlocking elements to this trap. And I think that what's significant about this interlocking nature is, again, it's this complexity, is that, and as Anna was just saying, you sort of pull one lever and you have so many unintended consequences. So this, I think, is why it's really vital to sort of think through instruments and with this complexity in mind. But fragile states, in terms of these 5 interlocking elements, first, fragile states make up subgroups with oppositional identities that militate against a shared national identity, vision, or project. What tends to happen is that there's competition to capture the state for the benefit primarily of their own groups. You may recall a book by Michaela Wong called It's Our Turn to Eat. It was focused on Kenya, but it applies in many, many contexts. Second, citizens themselves do not necessarily view the state as legitimate, not least because the state fails to provide the things that citizens would expect in terms of services, and therefore they may not be inclined to comply. Third, the state itself lacks the capacity, again, because it cannot deliver these basic services, and therefore it really is in this sort of predatory relationship with the citizens. And the fact is that poorly delivered infrastructure, health, education, security, etc., further weaken the state. Public officials owe more allegiance to their subgroups, and so they don't necessarily feel aligned to a national project. And the fourth is the problems reduce provision of security, they lead to violence. And so subgroups are in contest to capture the state with no unifying national projects. And the fifth, the private sector is weak. The instability, the capacity constraints, the poor provision of infrastructure, low health indices, low skilled workforce, and rent seeking by public officials all make the investment climate very hostile. They reduce the propensity to create jobs, and even the jobs that are created may just go to a chosen few. So the point about this is that these are self-reinforcing factors, and therefore, which is why fragility often perpetuates itself. And one of the problems, I think, with a lot of instruments, whether that's development policy or other instruments, is that they tend to deal with the symptoms and not the underlying causes, and actually make things worse. So in some ways, I'd say that Sierra Leone fits this broad schema. And in addition to that, Sierra Leone is, according to some estimates, the third most vulnerable country to climate change after Bangladesh and Guinea-Bissau. So it just compounds this kind of notion of fragility. So that's the sort of backdrop to this. And I don't know necessarily that Sierra Leone is a priority country for Finland, but I think Sierra Leone typifies a number of the challenges that Finnish development policy, in the way that Roger is suggesting, that needs to evolve and to deal with. So coming now to the capital city, which in Freetown in Sierra Leone, where the mayor of Freetown recently launched a Transform Freetown initiative. And she, as the mayor, was recently in an international meeting, actually on the sidelines of the launch of the Global Compact on Migration. And some of her fellow mayors from around the world were talking about the challenges that they have to integrate migrants. As you know, cities are often the receiving place for migrants. It's where the rubber hits the road. And so Mayor Akisoya, as she is, made the point that she only wished that she could keep more of the citizens at home and not actually create this challenge, as it were, for her fellow mayors. And this is a comment she made as a preface to an initiative to generate 4,000 jobs in the next 3 years in tourism-related industries. Now, 4,000 jobs is not a lot. I mean, Sierra Leone has something like 100,000 young people joining the labor force every year. And like many capital cities, Freetown accounts for something like 30% of the GDP of Sierra Leone, although it houses only 15% of the population, and it actually occupies only about 0.5% of the national landmass. However, I mean, it's a city that has grown to over 1 million residents. It was actually built for something like 250,000, 300,000 residents. And with a population growth rate of about 4.2% per annum, the population of the capital city will double by 2028. So in some ways, as I say, the 4,000 jobs that the mayor intends to create is relatively small, a small drop in the Atlantic Ocean, one might say. And the issue, and we talked about this last night with regard to these jobs, is that for many Sierra Leoneans, young Sierra Leoneans especially, they don't think of their country as a democracy, even though we have had regular elections for the last 20 or so years. Rather, they think of Sierra Leone as a connectocracy. And I don't know if you've come across this term, if you're a political scientist, but a connectocracy is a country that is run for the connected, by the connected, and of the connected. And it means that you don't expect to receive many of the benefits of development if you don't have the right connections. And so it's possible that these 4,000 jobs, as I said, is a small number, but if these jobs are distributed in a way that is transparent and fair and equal, the prospects that that will actually generate a certain amount of hope and optimism among young people is quite high. So that's a sort of challenge against which we need to think about how we're going to address these challenges. And there is a breakdown in the social contract that I think sets the scene for the push factors in relation to migration. And what we see is, in Sierra Leone, there's something called Temple Run, which is actually an adaptation of a game. But this is what young people call the irregular migration that they embark on, usually going from Sierra Leone to Guinea, from Guinea to Mali, from Mali to Niger, and then Niger onto Libya, and then on to Europe. And of course, with all the, as the data is showing now, that particular pressure is much reduced, but the push factors still remain. And I would like to give you a little bit of an example with one sort of group of economic actors. If you've ever been to many African cities, or maybe even Asian ones, you see commercial bike riders, people on bikes providing passenger services. And it's one of the industries that has evolved in the last, certainly in Sierra Leone, in the sort of post-war periods from the early 2000s. In Sierra Leone, the estimates, it's an informal sector, so it's hard to say, but the estimates suggest that something like 300,000 people earn their living through riding a bike and providing passenger services. So it is not an insignificant source of income for people. You could argue that it's probably one of the largest employers, actually, in Sierra Leone at the moment, informal as it is. And typically, commercial bike riding is also a very part of our sort of political patronage system, because there's some kind of co-optation by the political forces of bike riders and other informal sector workers, because this is also a source of political support during elections and so on. So it means that bike riding has been a source of income, but also a source of patronage. By aligning yourself with the right political forces, you can actually ride your bike, make a bit of money, but also break the law and sometimes use your political connections to get away with it. So this has been a kind of part of the landscape, and the kind of periodic tensions between the police and the bike riders, again, is not too unfamiliar in many other parts of the continent. So what has happened recently, it was some 2-3 years ago, a new appointee in the Ministry of Interior decided to crack down on the bike riders and reduce their movement in the central business district, which greatly reduced their income. And this particular individual had positioned himself as a disciplinarian, and therefore actually insisted on enforcing these regulations, because initially the bike riders thought that they would be able to find political solutions which would quickly reduce the ban, as had been the normal pattern. So I got involved with the bike riders about this time, because I saw this as an interesting move by the government to restrict the bike riders, but I also thought it wasn't sustainable, because in the long run I expected the ban to have to be lifted as the pressures increased. And because of my interest in promoting private sector development, I saw opportunities to transform, to work with the bike riders to transform their sector from kind of basic and informal sector to a business that would run passenger services, but courier services, advanced transportation, using technology, a bit like we have Uber, so you could be able to call up a bike on your phone. So there are lots of potentials for transformation to actually generate more jobs from a homegrown industry. But that required transformation of the bike riders themselves, of government response, the police who harassed the bike riders. It required quite some significant changes. And unfortunately, these changes were hard to come by. It's still an ongoing work in progress. And what I found out was that in the process, the bike riders, some of them became quite frustrated that this loss of livelihood, they interpreted as a sort of attack by the government on them. They didn't see it as a law and order issue. Some of the bike riders, around about 2016, decided to sell their assets. They had bikes that could sell for a couple of $1,000s. They could liquidate other assets. And then they went on this temple run. They went on this irregular migration out of Sierra Leone, trying to get to Europe. And it only became evident to me when every now and then I would be meeting the bike riders executive, and then they would say, well, they've actually got to attend a funeral, or they've got to go and commiserate with families of bereaved members of their group who had actually gone on this very, as we know, high-risk route. So this is how it sort of came to my attention. But I mean, the point here is that these kinds of links between, on the one hand, a government trying to crack down or trying to regulate an element of economic and social life, not necessarily creating the avenues for the transformation of this sector, which led to a certain frustration. And the young people, of course, who embarked on this route, they're not the poorest. They're actually quite dynamic. They're quite energetic. They're quite ambitious. It's just that they're frustrated with the lack of opportunities. It gets even more complex than that, because last year in Sierra Leone we had general elections, presidential parliamentary council. And again, because of this patronage system that we have, typically groups like the bike riders and the market women and other associations will kind of pick we have two dominant parties, so they will pick a winner. They'll just decide whether they think the incumbent's going to win or the main opposition. And though, of course, it's a high-risk strategy because they can get it wrong, and in this case, the executive did get it wrong. So some of the members of the Bike Riders Association supported the opposition party, some supported the incumbent. As a matter of fact, the incumbent lost the presidency, and so we had a new government in place. So the new government then tried to co-opt a new leadership that it believed was more sympathetic to its own way of life, its own way of thinking, which led to tensions between the old executive and the new government. And this led to arrests, and these arrests were because the police, of course, now that they had new political masters, tended to take on the bike riders as enemies of the state. So what that led to was a number of the bike riders executive having to go underground, having to hide away. And the result was, in fact, some of them had to actually leave the country. Paradoxically, one of them ended up in Finland here on the run. So that's just a way of, again, illustrating how I think these complex phenomena of our own politics, the search for livelihoods among young people, the pressures they face, and how these result in sort of tensions that can spill over into violence, into disorder, into clashes with the authorities, and indeed into more migratory pressures. And so I think that's the context within which we have to think about development challenges. And in the context of Sierra Leone, the city itself, which is, as I said, talks about Freetown, the political economy there is an important factor. In the case of Freetown, we have the mayor that I spoke of, Mayor Akisoya. She belongs to one party, and the presidency belongs to another party. There's a certain accommodation between them, but that's the context within which we have to find the coherent policies to generate these jobs that we need. So what I want to kind of suggest is that the Global Compact on Migration, which Roger has mentioned, and it definitely has its limitations, but is what we have now, it highlights a number of areas, perhaps, where we can think about solutions to these problems. They're not the full answer, but migration being part of the context here. There's obviously a need for effective coordination. There's a need for systemic and holistic approaches to these challenges. And youth employment is a key indicator as a driver, of the challenges that we're facing. And these are some of the issues that came out in the preliminary hearings leading up to the Global Compact on Migration. And so I think in the context of Sierra Leone and the jobs which might somehow over time reduce some of these pressures, which are not just about jobs, they're also about inclusion, they're also about governance, but really taking seriously this question of the systemic nature of the complex problems and really not dealing with things at just at symptomatic level. Understanding the challenges relating to youth unemployment and really to involve young people in the solutions and involve them at every stage, really. We don't have very simple answers to these problems. We really need to be prepared, I think, to take much more of a pilot approach, to see what works, to scale up those that don't work, and to drop things that really don't work. I think it's important to provide, as the compact makes provision for, more legal avenues for migration. And I think Anna's just highlighted some of the challenges, particularly in the EU context, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of that as part of the whole solution. And I think there are ways that we can, again, Anna talked about this, the point about the lack of skills among the would-be migrants, so really addressing skills in a way that actually builds skills, not just for migration, but also for staying in country. And one of the papers outside talks about the importance of networks, and I think this is where we should also be thinking about networks. Diaspora networks can also be part of facilitating the information flows, the investment flows that are required. It's important for there to be strong origin country buy-in and involvement. And there's a need for partnership based around collaboration. So I think that with these are some of the inputs that I would suggest that a Finnish development policy probably needs to factor in dealing with this level of complexity. It's, I think we are in uncharted territory to a large degree. It is actually quite hard to figure out. We're not in the sort of 1950s refugee convention era. We're dealing with much more complex interplay of factors, which requires, I think, a different way of approaching the problems. And I hope that that becomes part of the Finnish approach to international development. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olli. Thank you for organizing this seminar from our part, and of course for the Finnish Institute of International Affairs for good cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, the sharp-eyed audience, I presume, has noted my tie, which is the Malta EU presidency tie from 2017. And as you know, Finland will have its turn at the presidency of the European Union the latter part of this year. And I can tell you that we are not giving any gifts, but we have decided to compensate the climate effects of our presidency as the first EU member state. This is the Finnish perspective I will bring to this discussion. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor Zetter for your speech, which really gave us food for thought, and the other commentators bringing up aspects on the discussion. From the Ministry for Foreign Affairs point of view, I would like to highlight out two aspects in this discussion and to give you a little bit the Finnish point of view in matters already discussed. First, the global perspective with UN achievements and the challenges to the European Union. And second, the importance of the humanitarian development nexus and even with peace, the triple nexus, which was mentioned by Roger, and also the relation between development policy and migration. And I hope we will have some time for some questions and discussions, so I will be a little bit briefer than the previous speakers. The UN member states approved last December 2 documents which were outlined in the New York Declaration in 2016. Those have been mentioned, the two compacts, one on migration, and I always like to state the whole name of the compact, which is Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, and the other one on refugees. And of course, behind these compacts and the New York Declaration was the need to better address the challenges related to migration issues globally as a joint effort. Even if we have had the scope more on Africa today, which is very important for us and the European Union, of course, this is a global challenge, and as you know, the big migratory flows mainly in south-south more than between south and north. I think the Global Compact on migration can be seen as a balanced result in the context of different interests and the variety of situations, and it should be seen as a useful tool for international cooperation. And we just heard from case Sierra Leone and some suggestions how the Global Compact could then benefit also our policy planning here in Finland. It's a good tool for international cooperation and will hopefully contribute to a sustainable and better coordinated governance in these matters. It should bring wide-range cooperation, and also here was already mentioned the Libyan example, the UN, AU, African Union, European Union cooperation. So those are very important, and I hope there will be more of those kinds of actions. And of course, additionally, we shouldn't forget the national actions brought by the Global Compact. On European level, unfortunately, not all European Union member states joined the Global Compact on migration. As has been said here before, the European context changed dramatically in 2015 and gave fuel also to populist movements. After the negotiations on GCM ended in July 2018, a wide-range campaign, in my opinion, was launched in many European Union countries, based often on fake information, fake news, and mainly actually targeting internal politics. Unfortunately, this bore fruit, causing instability in many countries, e.g. in Belgium, and resulting in 6 member states staying outside of the Global Compact on migration. Not a very good example to other parts of the world. As was mentioned, of course, by Anna, this has an impact on our relations with others, third countries, and she mentioned Africa, of course. This was sad because the GCM tries to enhance the positive effects of migration and deal with the negative aspects in order to achieve safe, orderly, and regular migration flows instead of death and tragedy. And we should remember the migrants, as I mentioned, the migrants coming to Europe are only a small part of the global migration flows. But in the European Union, we should now look ahead. And of course, Finland bears its responsibility as the president of the Union latter part of this year. The best results can be achieved with common and comprehensive European solutions, and with third countries, win-win solutions in the migratory cooperation can be achieved only by true partnership and shared ownership. And this came up in Anna's comment as well, when we build the basis for our relations on migration. Of course, the EU internal negotiations on our budget, the multi-annual financial framework, are of crucial importance when thinking of EU's future actions on migration issues. And I don't go deeper in that because Anna already told the most important of it. My second point, in my second point, I would like to refer to the evaluation on forced displacement and the Finnish development policy, which was actually launched yesterday. And Professor Zetter, who mentioned the humanitarian development peace nexuses, actually led the evaluation team, producing a thorough report with recommendations. It's clear that when we are talking of the nexus aspect, we see it as a paradigm shift. Protracted crises and situations have changed our geography, and we have to see this on global, regional, and national levels. We face complex drivers and multi-causality of displacement, and this also has been already mentioned here. The importance of the humanitarian development nexus was actually agreed in the Global Compact on Refugees, approved December last year. And I can assure you that Finland has been active in pushing for improvements on this field in international fora. But on the national level, of course, I can also mention that large part of our humanitarian assistance is actually delivered in countries or regions where we do not have a bilateral development cooperation programs, and largely through international organizations and agencies. Therefore, the Nexus as a planning tool is much more limited for us, but within the European Union or international agencies, we can help strengthen the Nexuses, both double and also triple. And of course, I noted Professor Zetter's recommendation and the idea of further developing the triple Nexus and the Finnish activity on that. Finally, shortly on migration and development policy, which was also mentioned by Roger, which is an important and even hot topic when we speak of these issues. The aim of the Finnish development policy is to erase poverty and reduce inequality in compliance with human rights. It is preventive as by nature, but at the same time, of course, all development aid can be seen or has an impact on root causes of migration. For example, enhancing access to education and improving educational standards address root causes of irregular migration, but being at the same time core development policy. As the drivers of migration are complex and differ from case to case, development policy should be seen as only one tool to address it, and also I noted Roger aspects on this. Others being, e.g., climate policy, trade policy, peace mediation, and crisis management. As we're dealing here with challenging matters, I would like to end my comment on a positive note. But as we say in Finland, Roger already emptied the pajazzo, referring to the African Union decision in February for the theme year 2019. And I can still repeat it because I think it's an important decision. It's the year of refugees, returnees, and internally displaced persons towards durable solution to forced displacement in Africa. And of course, it celebrates those conventions, 69 Convention and the Kampala Convention from 2009, so 50 and 10 years celebrations in Africa. I think it shows us that migration is a key issue all over the world and requires common action. Thank you very much.